All right, everyone. Well, last week we definitely dove pretty deeply into current events, and I think it was the right thing to do. Don't regret it at all, but we are needing to now blitz through some content for a while to try to get back to a place where, if those of you who want to test for the exam in May um, would actually be ready. So, without further ado, here we go. So we left off on this question last week in our second unit of or second chapter of the um, linkage institutions unit, and we were talking about political parties, leaving off on the question of what do political parties do exactly? What is their mandate? And so the first point that we're going to cover here is that parties provide the label that politicians sort of ascribe to, and they endorse and officially nominate candidates for office, right? And so we saw that this summer with the conventions where, at the Democratic Party National Convention, the Democratic Party nominated Joe Biden as the Democratic candidate for president. But we also saw it in the state level, right, where the Democratic Party of Colorado nominated John Hickenlooper to run as their candidate, just like the Republicans nominated Cory Gardner to be the Republican candidate for Senate. Um, and so they endorse and they officially nominate candidates. But once they nominate a candidate, the role of the party doesn't just disappear. In fact, a lot of what a party does is only beginning once the nomination is given, right? In the fact that the party will then tend to rally behind that candidate, right? And move resources towards their candidates and run their campaigns, right? And so when John Hickenlooper won the nomination for Colorado Democratic candidate for Senate, the Democratic Party would send their pollsters and send their communications experts and consultants their way to help John Hickenlooper win. Because as we said, the point of a political party is to win. And so they do this at the national level for president, they do it at the state level for senators and House of Representatives members, and they do it at local levels, right, for mayoral candidates or Colorado State House candidates. Now, this one is a little bit more informal, but in many ways, political parties act like a brand, right? And just as we think brand for, clothing or cars, brands tend to symbolize something in the minds of people, right? And so, for if I say to you the brand Ferrari for car, the cue that's provided for consumers on Ferraris is, fast, powerful, exotic, and that brand provides cues for voters on candidates that they might not really know. So in this case, I might not know anything about John Hickenlooper, whether he's a good person or supports what I support. But I do see that he's the Democratic candidate, and as a result of this, that John Hickenlooper is a Democrat, right? And I know that the Democrats in general favor issues that I might favor, right? Environmental regulations and immigrants' rights and more active social policy proposals. Or on the flip side, I might not know anything about Cory Gardner, but I see that he's a Republican, right? And I know that Republicans tend to favor what I favor with guns or with business and taxes and regulations. And so they provide that brand identity for voters that provide them cues, right? And so they also advocate like policy. We saw when we were talking in the last unit that at the convention, the parties build their platform, right? And all the Democratic leaders get together from across the country to decide what do the Democrats stand for? What is the platform on which they're going to stand over the next 4 years? And this becomes their policy and that they favor, and this policy they advocate for it, right? And they push it and they say, well, we're supporting um, a Green New Deal to redesign the infrastructure and energy sources of our country to make it more environmentally friendly, right? And they spend the next 4 years advocating for that policy, and in the minds of voters, that can be effective, right? For whatever reason, it's really interesting. The Republicans provide a great case study for this. for so many years, all through the Cold War and Reagan and Bush and all that, the Republican Party was far more the anti-Russia, anti-Soviet Union party than the Democrats, right? And Republican voters really looked at Russia and they like hated them. That was public enemy number one. But for whatever reason, in the last 4 years of the Trump administration, the Republican Party, taking their lead from Trump, seems to have mellowed quite a bit on Russia. And in the minds of voters, the mellowing of the Republican Party towards Russia has allowed Republican voters to also mellow, and people think like, oh, they're not that big of a deal. And that is a great example of the Republican Party sort of, maybe not overtly, but inadvertently advocating for that policy, and their voters followed suit. Political parties also coordinate policymaking, right? And what I mean by that is, and we're going to get this in the next unit on Congress, but in order to pass a law, we know that you need both houses of Congress. You need the House of Representatives to say yes, then you need the Senate to say yes, then you need the president to say yes. And that's the only way to get a law, right? And so these political parties basically link and unify members of that party and allow them to kind of coordinate, right? And so the Democratic Party will get, probably in the first 100 days of the Biden administration, will kind of be on the phone with Democratic senators and House of Representatives members, basically saying, here's what we believe, here's what we're thinking, here's our strategy, here's what we want you to do. And this allows for more efficient lawmaking, right? Because the party itself is linking both houses of Congress with the incoming Biden administration. Now, this slide is a little bit more abstract and a little bit more boring, you might say, but I will also say that this slide in particular tends to be on this week's quiz, right? Which is some of these political science models. And so we're going to look at the Downs model and the rational theory model, but this is all under the umbrella of the question, in what way is a political party like a business, right? And I think this is a really interesting and accurate metaphor, because what do businesses compete for? They compete for customers, right? If I'm Samsung and Apple, right, I'm competing for customers, and I'm creating, branding and marketing and advertising and features, and I'm giving things to my customers to get them to say why I want to buy Apple. And so in many ways, I think of that as kind of the parallel for how the two-party system works. The Democrats and the Republicans are sort of like Apple and Samsung, and they are competing for customer support. Only it's not customer support, right? It's votes, right? And so what are they selling? Instead of an actual phone, they're selling policies, and they're selling an image. They're selling candidates, right? And so they're selling these candidates and their policies to voters with the idea that voters, particularly educated voters, and this is the role of education in a democracy, educated and informed citizens will then have a rational choice. And this rational choice theory is something that political scientists love to kind of cling to and talk about as a way to make sense of the political landscape. And what it says is essentially mirroring what we think of with capitalist principles, right? With competition, that competition between two products or two companies will force those companies to compete, right? Providing better outcomes for customers, right? If Samsung suddenly starts making crappy phones that break and don't serve their customers' needs or interests, then suddenly Apple is going to blow them out of the water and everyone's going to get an iPhone, right? And so this is sort of the same thing, that individuals are selfish. It's a basic capitalist tenet. Individuals are selfish. We do things for our own self-interest. We buy the phone that is cheapest, most reliable, with the features that we need, and we weigh each of those things and come to the decision that's best for us, right? And sometimes that decision, if we're kind of bougie people, would say, well, I'm going to spend the extra $200 not to get anything better necessarily, but to get a brand, because to me, brands are important, and so that's in my self-interest. And so we in politics will weigh the costs and benefits of alternatives. Well, And I think the Trump administration provides a great example of this. There's a lot of Republicans that said, I don't really like Trump. I think he needs to stop tweeting. I think he's kind of an a-hole and not very nice to people and all that, but I like his policies, right? And I like the laws that he's passing or advocating for. And so, I'm going to downplay and dismiss some of the nastiness that comes across his Twitter account and the things that I think are stupid that I think he should stop. Because in the end, I want lower taxes and I want more robust immigration enforcement. But individuals weigh these things. They weigh the costs and they weigh the benefits and they make a choice, right? And so, for example, if Party A figures out what voters want more accurately than Party B, then Party A will win, and vice versa. But this theory really relies on something that is increasingly happening. So it's easier, right? It's definitely happening right now, but at times in our history, it has been um, less present. And this idea really relies on the fact that the parties differentiate themselves, right? And this is kind of maybe supporting some of the polarization that we're seeing, where the parties are on either sides of the spectrum, right? Democrats are all the way to the left, and the Republicans are all the way to the right, because the parties have decided that in order to win voter loyalty, they need to differentiate themselves. And I think we're entering an interesting couple weeks where we might actually see the parties align. And this would compound the rational choice theory, because in this case, voters would not look at the issue of whether or not to impeach. Let's say the Republicans look at it and say, well, we want to impeach Trump too, right? Well, if that happens, then voters are not going to be able to make a choice based on that issue, because in this case, they're aligned. But in many cases, in many issues in the political world, parties have significantly differentiated themselves, allowing voters to make a clear, rational choice. And this is increasingly tricky in today's like social media heavy landscape, because, and we see this in the primary process, parties have to take care of their most ardent, passionate supporters, the ones that they know are going to turn up, their party faithful. They have to take care of their core supporters while also appealing to the majority of Americans who are kind of in that middle and they don't really like define themselves by either party. And that can be really hard. And we're going to see that in these next couple political data models, right? And I want to go ahead and take a look at this, right? Take a look at the chart on the top. This says basically that the majority of Americans, when asked to choose where do you fall on the political spectrum of liberal to conservative, from extremely liberal on the left to extremely conservative on the right, go ahead and put your dot where you fall on that spectrum. And if you ask, let's say you're doing a really good poll here and you get 3,000 voters, right? Because we know 3,000 will give us a small margin of error. And, it's a sound poll if you use random sampling techniques. But if you ask 3,000 people in like solid polling to place where they fall on that spectrum, essentially what you get is the chart on the top, right? That, 3 out of 100 people will say extremely liberal, and 3 out of 100 will say extremely conservative, and 12 out of 100 will say liberal, and 12, maybe 14 out of 100 will say conservative, and the overwhelming majority will then say right smack in the middle, right? That we are moderate, that some issues were to the left and some issues were to the right, and we're a moderate voter. And at the same time, if you look at independents especially, right, and this slice of the pie, the independents are really who Democrats are and Republicans are competing over, because Democrats know that they're going to get their 40% no matter what, and Republicans know they're going to get their 40% no matter what. The 40% of America that defines themselves as conservative Republicans are going to vote for them no matter what. And I think we've seen this with the Trump administration. So, but can you win with 40%? No, you really need like 51, 52%. And so as a result of this, they need to not only take care of their 40%, but then pick up 12% in the middle. And so if you were to ask independents specifically, um, where they fall, you see that independents, even more than the regular population, describe themselves as moderate.